Would you like to read from your latest book, The Signature of All Things?
Sure. Thank you all so much for coming and sharing this afternoon with us. It is very gratifying to see you all here. I'm very happy that you came. So this is my novel, The Signature of All Things, and I thought the easiest way to read something without having to explain any background is just to read you the first 3 pages, because then you'll be certain not to be left behind, and if you are, that's just very poor writing on my account, because hopefully this will give you a sense of the voice of this novel. Alma Whitaker, born with the century, slid into our world on the 5th of January, 1800. Swiftly, nearly immediately, opinions began to form around her. Alma's mother, upon viewing the infant for the first time, felt quite satisfied with the outcome. Beatrix Whitaker had suffered poor luck thus far generating an heir. Her first 3 attempts at conception had vanished in sad rivulets before they had ever quickened. Her most recent attempt, a perfectly formed son, had come right to the brink of life, but had then changed his mind about it on the very morning he was meant to be born, and arrived already departed. After such losses, any child who survives is a satisfactory child. Holding her robust infant, Beatrix murmured a prayer in her native Dutch. She prayed that her daughter would grow up to be healthy and sensible and intelligent, and would never form associations with overly powdered girls, or laugh at vulgar stories, or sit at gaming tables with careless men, or read French novels, or behave in a manner suited only to a savage, or in any way whatsoever become the worst sort of discredit to a good family, namely, that she not grow up to be a simpleton. Thus concluded her blessing, or what constitutes a blessing, from so austere a woman as Beatrix Whitaker. The midwife, a German-born local woman, was of the opinion that this had been a decent birth and a decent house, and thus Alma Whitaker was a decent baby. The bedroom had been warm, soup and beer had been freely offered, and the mother had been stalwart, just as one would expect from the Dutch. Moreover, the midwife knew that she would be paid, and paid handsomely. Any baby who brings money is an acceptable baby. Therefore, the midwife offered a blessing to Alma, although without excessive passion. Hanneke de Groot, the head housekeeper of the estate, was less impressed. The baby was neither a boy, nor was it pretty. It had a face like a bowl of porridge, and was pale as a painted floor. Like all children, it would bring work. Like all work, it would probably fall on her shoulders. But she blessed the child anyway, because the blessing of a new baby is a responsibility, and Hanneke de Groot always met her responsibilities. She paid off the midwife and changed the bed sheets. She was helped in her efforts, although not ably, by a young maid, a talkative country girl, and a recent addition to the household, who was more interested in looking at the baby than in tidying up the bedroom. The maid's name does not bear recording here, because Hanneke de Groot would dismiss the girl as useless the next day and send her off without references. Nonetheless, for that one night, the useless and doomed maid fussed over the new baby and longed for a baby herself, and imparted a rather sweet and sincere blessing upon young Alma. As for Alma's father, Henry Whitaker, the gentleman of the estate, he was pleased with his child, most pleased. He did not mind that the infant was not a boy, nor that it was not pretty. He did not bless Alma, but only because he was not the blessing type. "God's business is none of my business," he frequently said. Without reservation, though, Henry admired his child. Then again, he had made his child, and Henry Whitaker's tendency in life was to admire without reservation everything that he made. To mark the occasion, Henry harvested a pineapple from his largest greenhouse and divided it in equal shares with everyone in the household. Outside, it was snowing, a perfect Pennsylvania winter. But this man possessed several coal-fired greenhouses of his own design, structures that made him not only the envy of every plantsman and botanist in the Americas, but also blisteringly rich. And if he wanted a pineapple in January, by God, he could have a pineapple in January. Cherries in March as well. He then returned to his study and opened up his ledger, where, as he did every night, he recorded all manner of estate transactions, both official and intimate. He began, "A new, noble, and interesting passenger has joined us," and continued with the details, the timing, and the expenses of Alma Whitaker's birth. His penmanship was shamefully crabbed. Each sentence was a crowded village of capital letters and small letters living side by side in misery, crawling up one another as though trying to escape the page. His spelling was several degrees beyond arbitrary, and his punctuation brought reason to sigh with unhappiness. But Henry wrote up his account nonetheless. It was important for him to keep track of things. While he knew that these pages would look appalling to any educated man, he also knew that nobody would ever see his writing except his wife. When Beatrix recovered her strength, she would transcribe his notes into her own ledgers, as she always did, and her elegantly penned translation of Henry's scrawl would become the official household record. The partner of his days was Beatrix, and a good value at that. She would do this task for him, and 100 other tasks besides. God willing, she would be back at it shortly. Paperwork was already piling up. Thank you.
I love the fact that she's born with the century, and I wondered why you chose that date and that century to begin the novel.
I have a lot of trouble keeping track of people's ages, so I figured if she's born in 1800, I'll always know how old she is at various times in the book. There is actually a little of that. It made it really simple, but it's also a symbol of the importance of that century. The 19th century ended more differently than it began than any century in Western civilization. It closed out as an entirely different universe. And Alma was a witness to the incredible transformations and upheavals of that century, especially in the United States and in the world of science. The simplest example of the difference between the beginning and the end of the 19th century is that there really barely existed in the year 1800 in the Western world such a concept as an atheist, for instance. You could quibble over your interpretation of God, but it wasn't really a choice not to believe in God. And by the end of the 19th century, of course, it was a very different world indeed, industrially and scientifically. In the world of human rights, it was a completely different universe. At the beginning of the 18th century, there weren't very many people who were challenging the notion that slavery might not be such a great thing. By the end of the 19th century, that was gone. Women's rights were coming into being. The world had been explored, had been conquered. Colonies were turning into nations. It was incredibly, almost violent and passionate age. And I wanted her to be at the center of all of that.
It's interesting that this is a world of science and of trade and discovery and so on, but money seems to be at the basis of certainly Alma's family's engagement in it, doesn't it? Certainly Henry is not there for anything but the account books and the ledgers.
Well, yeah, and the account books and the ledgers in her father's life are not there for any other reason than to keep track of who he's dominating. He's a power-based person, and I think that was a bit of what was going on in that century as well. Alma's mother is sort of an academic and more of a pure scientist who teaches her daughter how to appreciate the intellectual world. Henry is a creature of commerce, and he's a creature of ambition, and he's also a self-made man, which is a very American idea. He was born in England, but you can almost see that there's no other country he could have gone to in order to become the captain of industry that he ended up becoming. He was a great botanical innovator who ended up essentially founding the American pharmaceutical trade. He was kind of the first big pharma CEO, really, inside of his estate in Philadelphia.
I found that very interesting too, that you have sort of ideas of what were the basic emphases of trade in the 19th century, and pharmaceuticals and basically botanical seeds and plants didn't occur to me as having such central importance. But you begin with Joseph Banks, don't you? And you put Henry in a relationship with Banks, you send him off with Cook, which I guess was the start of that.
It was. I mean, Banks was really the beginning force of botanical entrepreneurship. And it was a huge business. And I knew that I wanted to write a book about plants because I've recently become quite an obsessive gardener, although I don't really know that there's another kind. And I wanted to write about the botanical world. And I was fascinated, as you say, to discover that it was just this world of power and money and intrigue and theft. That plant theft was a serious crime at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, that it was a hanging crime. I decided to make Alma's father into a plant thief and have him face the gallows, because it just showed the value of what they were dealing with then. And when you start to think about it, it all makes sense, because the great industries of that time were cotton, which is botany, were medicinal trades, certainly the spice trade. So one of the biggest decisions I had to make with this book was, if I'm going to create this character whose father becomes essentially one of the first multimillionaires of the New World in a plant trade, which one is it going to be? And I thought that the medicinal plant trade, and especially what we call quinine, and I believe you call quinning, yes. I just want to make sure you all understand my garish accent, that seemed to be the most fascinating to me.
You say that Beatrice is more academic. She is a gardener too, isn't she? And she devotes her life to a particular kind of garden, which I thought was the most beautiful image. Would you like to describe what her gardening principles were and what she manages to achieve?
Yeah, this is Alma's mother, who her father picks up in Amsterdam on his journeys, and he chooses very deliberately to have a Dutch wife, because he's traveled the world and he's more impressed with the Dutch than he is with anybody, because they were the bankers of the world, really, and he liked their Calvinistic ditch digging work ethic, and the sort of pragmatism of Dutch women. He wanted a really solid wife, so he gets himself a Dutch wife, and she's the daughter of one of the great botanical empires of Holland. Her parents and her family have been running the Hortus botanical gardens in Amsterdam for generations. So she's got this sort of encyclopedic botanical knowledge within her mind. When they settle in Philadelphia, she creates a Euclidean garden. She creates a garden that is based on classical Euclidean geometric principles. It's all cones and balls and angles and mathematical, sort of, in Beatrix's mind, witty mathematical equations, the kind of thing that somebody like her would find terribly funny, and sort of a really inside joke. And it's only an inside joke to somebody who's spent her life reading Euclid in Greek. And so that's who she is. And so Alma grows up with that mind on one hand, educating her and formulating her. And on the other hand, she grows up with her father's restless, roaming, uneducated but extremely brilliant, aggressive, ambitious business mind. And that's who creates the heroine of our story.
There's a point towards the end of the book where somebody tells Alma, you are compelled by a desire for comprehension. And then he says, but I am a conqueror. And I wondered whether that's a division in the world between those who want to know and those who want to conquer.
Yeah, those who want to understand and those who want to do something with it. And I think Alma, what I find most interesting about her and what I really fell into engagement with her when I was writing it was the purity of her scientific mind. This is an entirely empirical being, which I am not, right? Like I have a lot of room in me to believe in and interact with stuff that is unseen or only to be imagined. And Alma only is capable of believing and almost only capable of loving what she can see in black and white, what can be proven. And there's something so gorgeous about a mind like that, because that's where all of our scientific ideas have come from, are people like that. But it almost keeps her narrowed, where her head is sort of down in a microscope the whole time at the atomic level. And meanwhile, this whole world is going on around her of power and dominance and action. And there is a moment in the book where she becomes an action hero as well. Perhaps not a conqueror, but certainly a doer.
I want to be very careful with my questions not to reveal basic plot twists.
Yeah.
But there's a lovely thing that she says really as quite an old lady towards the end of the book. She says, I've never felt the need to invent a world beyond this world, because this world has always seemed large and beautiful enough for me. And that's what you mean by that, isn't it? And I find this really interesting, because this doesn't seem to be the position in your memoir, Eat, Pray, Love, at all.
Oh, no, I'm
which is
inventing
about
worlds all the time.
What's outside the world.
Yeah, and you know where I got that idea was from, I heard an interview with an atheist, and I have to say I saw one of the best things on Twitter recently. Somebody said, I wish I loved anything as much as atheists love talking about being atheists. It was just so great. But anyway, I was listening to this sort of prominent atheist, and he made this point that I found very touching and very humane, where he said something along the lines of, how dare you not have this be enough? You know, look what you've been given in this world, and how dare you be unsatisfied with that? And he almost made religion into this insult to the magnificence and the grandeur and the mystery of what's here already. This idea of human impatience and human restlessness, that for some reason this isn't enough, that we have to sort of invent paradises, and we have to invent hells when there's plenty of paradises and hells right before us. And I was really touched by that, even as somebody who seeks, I seek mysteries beyond what I see. I found that really beautiful and compelling, and I thought there's something that's sort of at the fundamental, there's some great reverence in that, right? And reverence is a word that you don't always associate with atheism, but I wanted to instill that in Alma, that her love of the real is not about a rejection of beauty or grandeur or mystery. It's about a recognition of beauty and grandeur and mystery plenty in what's laid out in front of her, and that you don't have to look very hard for it if you're looking carefully in your own universe.
And the overtly Christian characters in this novel are not successful. They're not happy. They don't achieve what they want. Ambrose, the missionary in Tahiti, and so on, formalized religion of any kind, or even the kind of alternative religion that Ambrose tries to engage in, doesn't seem to work within the novel at all, does it?
Gee, I don't know if I agree. I think of my missionary character as being kind of wonderfully contented.
Not very successful at converting people.
Oh, terrible. As he says, I'm a much better Christian than I am a missionary. And that's the kind of missionary I think we could have had more of. But he strikes me as somebody, he's a little bit based on my father, somebody who has just found contented with his little place in the world. And doesn't need to kind of turn the world upside down or set it on fire. So I wouldn't say that he's an unhappy person, although his life has certainly not necessarily been the happiest life. I feel him to be kind of very steady in his sense of himself. Ambrose, another character in this book, is very much a familiar type to me. I sort of border on being like him myself. The hungry ghost is what they call them in Buddhism, right? The hungry ghost is somebody who walks through this world always wanting something that isn't here, and I know those people because I walk among them, and I sort of have one foot in the real and one foot with the hungry ghosts, because I know what unfulfilled desire feels like. I know what it is to want something, to want kind of transcendence, that the real isn't enough, that you want to be, you don't really want to, you want to be an angel, you want to be kind of a fairy, you don't even necessarily want the demands of humanity. And so it wasn't difficult for me to write him, because I know him well, and I know so many people like him, and I love him, and he breaks my heart. But that's a type of a person. And they tend to be people who create tremendous beauty in the world, but may not create it from the most contented place.
Yes, beauty and havoc at the same time.
Beauty and havoc, my God. And she does exactly what women do when they meet the first man they meet who creates beauty and havoc. She falls completely in love with him, as we all do, because there's something so shimmering and glorious about that kind of person. But my God, don't plant your flag on it, because it's just a mess.
Yes. Angela.
Knowing laughter comes from every corner of the room on that one.
Well, I always like Angela Carter, who says that women spend their first 20 years of their adult life looking for Heathcliff, and the next 20 years trying to get away from him.
Oh, and cut.
Okay, Okay, so we moved into women's lives here, and I want to ask you about thinking about Eat, Pray, Love, where you were very much concerned with the potential of women's lives and the way they might achieve that potential. Is this novel the signature of all things? Does it have the same concern?
Oh yeah, very much so. And it also is concerned with another theme that draws me to women's stories and women's lives, which is the theme of resilience. And I think that's the least celebrated female virtue. And I think in literature it's the least celebrated female virtue because most of literature has been written by men. And when men tell women's stories, there's only two stories that they know how to tell, generally speaking, in the history of Western literature, which is the story of a woman who is either rescued or ruined by a man. And that isn't the story of the women's lives who I know and admire. All of us may have, at times, dreamt of being rescued or feared that we were to be ruined, but most of us were neither. And most of us also, I think the other really interesting thing about women is that because of, I think, our particular sensitivities, we have a tremendous susceptibility to disappointment. Women can be enormously disappointed, but we don't die from it, or else none of us would be here today, right? We don't die from it. We manage to somehow, with this particular sort of alchemy, transform it into wisdom and grace and perspective and strength. And that's the story of women that I love and that I love to tell, because that's the story of every woman who I want to be like and who I admire and whose examples set the path for me. And Alma's story is very, very much that. And that's the story I think I'll probably always be telling.
One of the things about Alma's story in comparison to modern women are the social constraints that are set around her, which are extreme, aren't they? She really is, for most of her life and for most of the book, confined to house and garden almost.
Yeah, but what a house and what a garden.
Yes,
right? Because she grows up in the finest estate in Philadelphia with the finest library in the Western world and this genius mother and this genius father. So in one regard, she has this incredibly privileged, for a woman of that time, access to the entire universe of ideas, and no limits are put upon her in terms of her mind. Her mother's teaching her Greek by the time she's 5. She's got the whole universe inside her imagination, but it's all within a 1-mile radius. And so it's compacted, and there are limits within that. And that sense of denial of the world or limitation of the world is another thing that I find particularly interesting about women's journeys, and I'm fascinated by the ways in which women traditionally have worked within those narrowed worlds to have creative expression, to make things, to invent things. What do they do to not go mad? And so, as you say, a good half of the book is sort of the story of Alma's discoveries within that miniaturized universe. What I discovered, though, when I started doing research about the great 19th century lady botanists, is that some of them, and particularly later in life, post-menopausally, I would say more or less, went off in the world and had some pretty raucous adventures, and became really bold travelers. And so it's been said that there are only two stories that have ever been told. You go on a trip or a stranger comes to town. Those are the only two narratives that exist. Yes. And for women's stories, generally speaking, that story is usually only a stranger comes to town, right? You are the one in the passive position of waiting for an adventure to come to you. While Odysseus is out conquering the world, Penelope's got that big weaving and unweaving scene that she's doing for like 30 years. That's the woman's story, and he's having the Odyssey. But what I discovered was that a lot of these Victorian lady botanists then went on their own odysseys. And so I think half of this novel is the story of a stranger coming to town in Alma's life. Yeah. And then the second half of the novel is you go on a trip. And at that point, she becomes the disruptive force, because when you go on a trip, you're the one who enters into a new world and changes things. As they say in Breaking Bad, I'm the one who knocks. After a certain point, Alma becomes the one who knocks.
For the first part of her book, when she's a young woman, a lot of the constraints are sort of within her mind, aren't they? That's one of the frightening things about that constrained lifestyle that a 19th century woman might lead, is that they would agree with it and they would monitor it and they would monitor other women leading it and so on.
It would never occur to you to challenge that unless you were, I don't know, Abigail Adams, but she's not even 19th century. There was this little moment at the end of the 18th century during all the revolutions, right, where there was this kind of burst of this idea of women demanding more autonomy. There's that painful letter that Abigail Adams wrote to John Adams when he was drafting the American Constitution, where she said, "Don't forget the ladies," you know. And she writes him this beautiful letter, and she said, "Look, you need to give us liberty too, in the same way that you've demanded it now. And you need to make sure that women have chances to become parts of this society. Don't leave us out." And she was his right-hand man his entire life, somebody who he respected and revered. And the letter that he writes back to her is so dismissive and contemptuous, where he's sort of like, that's silly. You know, next you'll be saying that we should let the black people have a voice, you know? And sort of right after all those revolutions settled and a conservatism fell upon the Western world, that disappeared for another 80, 90 years. And that voice wasn't really heard again until Alma would have been, till the middle of the 19th century, till she would have been a middle-aged woman. There was this confinement that was returned to women, and she grew up in that.
You've got two women characters the same age as Alma, her adopted sister, Prudence, who's not really called Prudence, but is named Prudence to sort of put her in a particularly safe place, and her friend Retta. And both of them demonstrate in different ways the sort of confinements. And I guess what happens to them demonstrates how you could possibly get out of that sense of confinement too, doesn't it, in both cases?
Yeah, I mean, what I wanted to do too with that was, I'm fascinated by triads of female friendship. My grandmother used to say when I was a kid and I would come home from school in tears because I was in the middle of a thing when I was 8 years old between Kelly and Nancy, my two best friends, and they'd turned on me or I'd turned on one of them, or we'd all like, you know, like she said, there's nothing more evil than three little girls. And, you know, like there's some weird energy that happens with a threesome of girls. And I wanted to sort of play with that tension. There's something kind of unstable about that tension. And I also wanted to create these three girls who each demonstrate one very powerful aspect of femininity, but don't have the others. So Prudence is restraint, completely. That is all she is. She's 100% restraint. Alma is 100% intellect, and Retta is 100% impulse. And none of them have any of those other virtues. And I feel like if there had been some balance where they could have each been a little bit of all of those things, they might have had calmer lives or easier lives. But instead, it's almost like they got dispatched. I was like, they like it happened to them. Like I didn't do it to them, but you know. But I thought it was more interesting to make them each be stuck in this identity of, you know, the impulsive one, the moral one, and the intellectual one.
In the title of Eat, Pray, Love is a sort of shorthand for what heals and nourishes in the book. The signature of all things seems to suggest that in addition to praying and loving, work is really important. And Beatrice and the housekeeper Hanneke saying, you know, improve yourself to this young child, and Alma deciding on her sort of scientific career in a sense, is a demonstration of how important work is. But very few women in the 19th century actually had access to that, did they?
All they did was work.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, to be honest, all they did was work. So we can't say they didn't work. They didn't have vocation necessarily. And I feel like one of the messages of this book, though I hope I don't club anybody with it, but one of the messages that I feel really strongly about in life in general, and I think it will leak into anything that I write, is that a woman needs a vocation. A woman needs a vocation, and it doesn't have to necessarily be the source of your income, but it does have to be the source of your identity. And you do have to have a relationship with it that has nothing to do with your relationships with others. Because generally speaking, there's this idea that women can only be defined by relationship, right? Like the success or the failure of a woman in most novels is, did or did she not marry well? Was she or was she not a good mother? Is her engagement with her family appropriate or inappropriate? Therefore, is she a good and satisfied woman or not, right? I don't think that goes far enough to answer the hunger of a woman's soul, which is not that different from the hunger of a man's, in that there's something that you might want to make or do or say that's beyond, and I don't mean to diminish relationship, but that's beyond relationship. And so for Alma, there's this restlessness that she has that is so familiar to me. There's a point in the book where I talk about her realization that her world is smaller than she thought it was. Having grown up on a grand estate, she always felt like she lived in a big world until she had conquered it, at which point it became confining. And I write about how her mind is like a caged tiger, just pacing, and she's afraid of it, and it needs an occupation, or else it's going to turn on her. And that's a feeling I've had my entire life, and it's why I write, it's why I make work. If you don't give this thing something to do, it's going to do something very bad. And so I think the idea of celebrating a woman's passion, a woman's vocation, a woman's occupation is a story that needs to be told, if only to give permission to that desire.
Yes, it's difficult in a novel because the novel is so kind of community relationship based, isn't it? I mean, a novel with one single person in it, Robinson Crusoe, I guess, but certainly not the female authored novels. Even somebody like Charlotte Bronte, who felt exactly as you describe about the limitations of her life, when she puts it into a novel, it's Mr. Rochester who's going to be the solution.
Yeah, although she's kind of the solution to him, I think. In the end, although he's
maimed.
Oh man, he's such a hot mess, Mr. Rochester, and I'm so attracted to him, and he's such a disaster. But that's not what you asked. It's really hard. I think even for somebody with a mind as electrifying as the Brontes, a collective mind as electrifying as the Brontes had. I think it must have been very difficult for them to imagine what other story you could tell other than a woman and her relationships. And there are certainly relationships in this book. There's family relationships, there's romantic relationships, there's intellectual relationships, but the fundamental guiding relationship of this story and this woman is her relationship with her work. And that's something that I get deeply because the fundamental guiding relationship of my life has been my relationship with my work. And when all the rest of it has fallen to bits, that's been the piece that has kept me sewn together. That's been the way that I know myself, is through that work, and the respect that I have for that work and the discipline that I have for it.
And by work, in your case, do you mean writing? That's
Yeah.
a very strange kind of work, isn't it? It's a very kind of engaging and exasperating form of work.
Yeah, but it's better than working. It's funny, I was saying the other day, somebody asked me if I found writing difficult or easy, and it's a question I don't even know how to answer because I don't care if it's difficult. I think that's sort of the definition of a vocation versus work, is that you don't care. If you're being guided by your love and devotion to something, it can be hard, and it's still incredibly satisfying. It's almost more satisfying. I think one of the problems where people lose the path in creativity is that they quit when it gets difficult, and when it gets difficult is when it gets interesting. And I'm always trying to encourage people not to quit just when it's starting to get interesting. Because the interesting part is solving the dilemma of the creative block and working your way through it. Or there's a children's book, I don't know if you have it here, but it's called Over, Under, Through. And it's just this little, and that's the creative dilemma, is you've got this obstacle, and then you have to figure out whether you can go over it, under it, or through it. And that's the fascinating part to me. And there's this kind of adrenaline that I get in the moments of really difficult creativity that I can't find anyplace else. And it's the challenge of, well, now you've done it. Now you've boxed yourself into this. How are you going to get over it, under it, or through it? Let's go. What's it going to be? And so I don't really mind the sweat, because that's where the good part is.
In your TED talk, which was about the creative genius. You talked about the way that you thought that our present-day European culture has a very unhelpful, unhealthy view of creative inspiration. Do you want to explain that a little?
Oh, I would love to. I really would love to, because this is really kind of my mission. I mean, I sort of feel like I have two. One is to write books because I love them, and the other is to preach the true believe in about creativity. And I get a little evangelical about it only because it just maddens me to see the perpetuation of the fetishizing of suffering when it comes to creative life. And this is something that really started in earnest with the German Romantics. Actually, really started in earnest with the Renaissance and the sort of the idea of putting the individual at the center of the universe, and breaking this idea that prior to then had existed in Western civilization and still exists in a lot of other cultures, which is to say that a person is not a genius. A person has a genius. And the genius is on loan to that person for the duration of your life, and it's a contract between a human and the mysteries of inspiration, and it's a collaboration, and it's something that's to be approached with respect and with reverence and honor. The new idea, and by new I mean in the last few centuries, is that you are at war with your talent, and that it's this very masculine idea that you have to wrestle it. I mean, all the terms, all the language that gets used around creativity that people have just swallowed and accepted, from Truman Capote saying to kill your darlings, from the way that people will say when they're working on a project and they've kind of gotten over a hump, they'll say, I broke its spine, I broke its back, from the idea of wrestling bloody-knuckled, this book is going to kill me or I'm going to kill it. I have a young guy who I sort of mentor who I think is a brilliant writer, but I'm trying to shake this out of him as much as I can. He wrote his book and he was like, I want everyone to fuck my book now because it's like so hot. Like I made this thing and I'm like, what is with you guys? Like you want to kill it or rape it or I don't know, like what? It's just so aggressive. How about collaborate? How about collaborate with something that is so ancient and magical and that is such a gift and not a punishment? How about getting off the cross and getting to work, and getting to work sober? You know what I mean? With respect and humility and gratitude and grace. How about those virtues, which I think are older than this idea that, you want to stab it to death somehow and then hold up the skin of it, of this thing that you killed, So yeah, I'm happy to talk about that.
So your argument is that if you don't kill it or rape it or subdue it, there's something wrong with you.
Well, certainly the romantic idea is if you are not suffering for your art and causing tremendous suffering around everyone around you, you're not doing it right, or you're not a serious artist, right? I remember I had a high school teacher who said to me, "You're very gifted, but you'll never make it as a writer because you haven't suffered enough." First of all, I was a 14-year-old girl. What did he know about suffering that I had not experienced that day in the lunchroom, right? But secondly, what? Like what? And what a weird message to give to a young person who's excited about creativity. Like what if I was bent enough to have taken that to heart and decided I now have to go out and seek that in order to establish my credentials as a serious creative person? What a crazy thing to say to it. Like, wow, warped and broken is how I see that.
Absolutely.
Weird.
Yeah, do you have anything more you'd like to say?
Yeah, I do. I really do. I also think, no wait, let's go on. Otherwise I'm just going to get because I get really passionate about it. And I keep trying to figure, I want to write a book about this, but I can't figure out how to do it without getting really angry. And I don't want to write an angry book. I want to write an empowering and in the best definition of the word, enabling book, an invitation to perhaps see this in a different and more healthy way. But all I end up doing is being like, stop!
People here get slightly churned up about creative writing classes and teaching creative writing and university courses in creative writing. But it seems to me that they actually are really good in terms of what you're objecting to, because they are sort of disciplined and sober, and you pay your fees and come along to your classes on Wednesday afternoons and so on. That might help.
Look, if it helps, it helps. I didn't do it that way because I didn't do it that way. I had a different path, and I used to be a bit of a fascist about saying that you don't really need that you should be able to do it on your own, but I've subsequently mellowed a lot about that, because I think, look, different, many rivers, one ocean, whatever it takes to get you there. And I think sometimes the only way that people will feel like they have the power to write is if a teacher tells them that they can, or if somebody gives them a diploma and says that now you're a writer, because there's a diploma on it. I don't think you need a permission slip to make art. And I think that art is kind of the opposite of that, actually, a little bit. But I do think that those classes can be really useful. What I object to about them is only, and this is maybe something that doesn't happen here, it happens in the States because of how we run things. What I object to is people going into debt to get a degree in art. And I never think you should go into debt for your art. I think it's unfair to your art, because then it's really hard to be an artist when you're in debt. It's okay to be broke, but it's not great to have debts, because then that's a weight that causes you to not be open, and debt creates fear and anxiety, and fear and anxiety, of course, murder creativity. So if it's a question of going into debt to get a permission slip diploma to say that you're a writer, or not doing that, I would advise not doing it. And I would certainly also leave a classroom immediately if it feels like it is a theater of competition and pain and suffering, and staying in it if it feels like it's generative and healthy and encouraging. Because sometimes those classes can be quite savage as well, which I don't think is good.
I guess they're relationships like any other relationship, aren't they? And there are good relationships and bad relationships. Yeah. I'm aware that people would like to ask questions, but I want to, just for a minute, use my chair's prerogative and ask you a slightly left field question, and that is yoga. Now, I practice yoga, and I think practice is a really good word to describe what I do, and I really like it, but I find it very difficult to see it in a sort of spiritual sense at all. And yet it's obviously a huge part in Eat, Pray, Love.
Yeah.
As a discipline, as a culture, as a practice, and so on.
I don't think it has to be spiritual. I keep wishing somebody would start something called Noga, which would be yoga without the God stuff, so that people whose bodies could really benefit from it would go do it. Because I know that people like my husband are like, if I have to listen to some lady tell me to chant, I'm out of there in 2 seconds, right? And fair enough, I don't think that should be forced down anybody's throat, but certainly those stretches are very good for your spine and hamstrings, and it might be nice to go to a class where you're not made spiritually uncomfortable. I don't think anybody should have to do that. It kind of works for me just because I'm a restless person, and it calms me down, and I'm always looking for ways to be a little bit less and because there's no translation for that, but I think you know what it is, yoga tends to sort of bring me to a place where I can, kind of get out of my own chatter and think about for 10 seconds about something more profound and eternal, only for 10 seconds at a time, but it does help a bit.
Okay. Now, we are able to get people to ask questions. We have 2 runners with microphones. If you want to ask a question, could you put your hand up and wait for the microphone so we can all hear you?
And can I ask you a giant favor that your question have a question mark at the end of it? Because sometimes I have to try to figure out what the question is. So usually if you can actually form it into a question, it's easier for me to help answer it. Everybody else. Yeah, everyone's like, rephrase it. Now she's making grammatical rules. Yeah, I can repeat it back, or wait, here she comes. Yay! Go! Pass it down.
Hello. Hi. Next. I just had a question. I've just finished my first manuscript of my first ever novel, which is quite exciting.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I've just had my first beta reader have a read of it. One person has...
What kind of reader?
Beta reader. So just the first person that's ever read it who will first ever read it.
What was the word?
Beta. Beta.
B-E-T-A?
Yeah.
I've never heard the term beta reader. Okay, go ahead.
So she's just finished reading it and gave me great feedback. So I'm on my second go through of it. But my question is, how many times is enough before it's, you feel comfortable to send it out to people? Like, how many times do you have your manuscripts read by people and get their feedback and rework it until you feel it's ready? I'm just curious.
It depends on first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
And good luck with it.
Thank you.
It depends on the book. Some things need to be done a bunch of times and some things don't. And honestly, I think the only way you'll know that is through years of doing it. And you may have to trust other people now a little bit, right? You may have to, at some point you'll have to settle on a central authority, whether it's an editor or somebody whose opinion you completely have faith in, to say this is done or this is not done. If you don't know, right? Like if you don't know in your bones, then you'll have to ask somebody else. I would advise you though to be careful not to do this thing, which is like, think of it like this. You've just built a house. Right? You're a carpenter, you've just built your first house. And now comes the part where people are going to come over and they're going to look at it and they're going to be like, I think the porch should be on this side, and it's weird to have the double chimneys, and why didn't you put the driveway...
I don't think that character would do that.
Yeah, like they're going to start kind of, and there'll be certain things that I think you can change, like the color of the paint job or where the shutters are. Should somebody come to you and suggest changes that mean that you have to dismantle your entire house and rebuild the foundation and start from the beginning, I would advise you against doing that.
Sure.
Because that is something that will never end, right? And then you'll never get, see, the thing that makes me finish a project is that I want to build another house. And if you spend the rest of your life taking down that house and putting it back up again and taking it down and putting it back up again, you're never going to be able to do the next thing. And the next thing, you'll be better at it because you already built a house. So there's a sense of an acceptance of a certain amount of imperfection that you have to sort of swallow so that you can just go do the next thing, and let that perfect thing stand at a certain point and just be like, enough. Look, I can tell you everything that's wrong with this book. I know, and I'm not going to fix it because it's good enough. Yeah. And I was lucky enough, I've said this on Facebook a million times, you've probably heard me, if you're on my Facebook page, say this a million times. I was lucky enough to be raised by a very pragmatic mother, not unlike Beatrix Whitaker, whose famous line was, done is better than good. And at some point, getting something done is better than getting something perfect, because perfect, of course, doesn't even exist. So tidy it up, fix it up, put it on the market, try to sell it. If it doesn't work, make another one.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Would you like to just move the
this lady here,
microphone down
if
to
you
here?
don't mind, you can just pass it down.
Yes.
Hi, this is a bit of a cheeky question, as we would say in New Zealand. Does it bother you that a talk like this has a title that refers to a book that you wrote almost 10 years ago, while you're actually here to discuss your latest work?
Dude, I'm so grateful that anyone gives a shit about anything that I've ever done. Like, how petulant would I have to be like, I am not that person. I am so lucky, that I get to do this work at all. I was lucky before Eat, Pray, Love that I got to be a substance writer, that I got to do that work. I'm infinitely luckier now. It has been such a fountain of blessing to have written something that not only was helpful to me, but seems to have been helpful to other people, and then also enables me to do this. Like, this book is largely a celebration of what I got from Eat, Pray, Love, which was not only sort of emotional stability enough to be able to write novels again, but also the financial independence, if I may be very blunt, to not have to go to a publisher and say, hey, how would you guys feel about giving me an advance to write a 500-page novel about a virginal 19th century spinster who spends her life studying moss? Because you know what? They would be like, yeah, you know what? No, we'd really rather that you wrote another memoir about depression than that. And I didn't have to ask. I don't ever, unless I just get a huge coke addict addiction and just become an idiot or gamble it away, I I should never have to ask permission again to do anything. And very few artists and writers have had that kind of privilege in this world, and glancingly few women of any background have had that kind of privilege. So if I do anything, if you guys ever catch me doing anything short of bowing in gratitude to Eat, Pray, Love, slap me. And I also know already that my obituary headline is going to be Eat, Pray, Die. It's just going to follow me to my grave.
Hello.
Hey.
The Jamaican Scottish writer Kai Miller talked earlier in the week about a big part of his writing process being disguising his research. Now, writing a novel about the 19th century has to involve a lot of research. Can you say something about whether the business of disguising research was something that exercised you in the writing of that novel, and if so, how you might have done so?
Do you know, I think the best answer I've heard to this, and that's beautiful, I haven't heard that term. What I really was trying to avoid was, I did do like almost 4 years of research on this. It was really delightful for me because I'm such a nerd and I could live in a library, and I was so happy spending 8 hours a day reading about 19th century botanical exploration. I did not want to punish anyone with that. You know, like there is that sense sometimes where you read a heavily researched book where the author's like, I spent 5 years researching this and now you will all pay. You know, like you don't want to do that. And so I think the way to avoid doing that is to think of it as learning a language. Right? Like, certainly when you're writing a historical novel, what I needed to do was learn 19th century botanical exploration as though it was a foreign language. And then once I'd learned it and immersed myself in enough, I could just speak it without translating it as I was going. And so that's the preparation that goes into this. So after 4 years of being imbibed with this, when I sat down to write, I was writing in the new language that I knew how to speak. And when you're just having the language in your bones, then I don't think you need to have the footnotes that say, it would have been a whale oil lamp, with oil that was brought from the Southern Pacific and probably came into port in New York. Like, I know that, but you don't need to know that. As long as I know that sort of in my marrow, I don't think I need to sort of put it on every sentence of the page. I also can't believe that I just gave the double middle finger in this very... I've sort of been, ever since I did that, I was like, that was a little uncool. Maybe they can, in the video, they can just like they do with boobs on
they can blur
TV,
it.
they can just blur it out, or just superimpose waving. Like, I was just waving.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
I just want to ask, how did you get to be a writer? Like, what started off? How did you start off being a writer? Like, what age did you start?
As soon as I could. I've had a very simple. I complicate my life in so many ways, and nobody can complicate my life more than I can complicate it myself. But I'm lucky enough that I have this one certain thing, and the only thing that I have ever wanted to be or do was to be a writer and to do writing. And that made a certain aspect of my life very easy, because then if that's all you have and that's all you love, then you just make sure that every decision you make is forwarding that. So that just made it really simple. And my goal, I remember really formally committing myself to it as a teenager, almost like the way that you would to a religious order, and for the same reason, for the reason of devotion and service to this thing. And I remember my goal was to have something published before I was dead. And that took a lot of pressure off, because people in my family really live a long time. I have a 101-year-old grandmother. My grandfather just passed away at 97. I figured that gave me a long time before I had to panic. And that kept me going through the years where it wasn't working, where I wasn't, meaning that I wasn't getting published, and I wasn't getting that reward, that jolt. But sometimes I'm hesitant to tell that story, because I don't want it to sound like that's the only way that you can go be a writer, that you have to have known it since you were 5, because that's not at all the case. And it's something that you can enter into it at other points in your life. There's so many pathways to it, whether that's formally through an academic path, or whether it's personally, whether it's through poetry, whether it's through journalism, whether it's through prose, every writer that I admire has come to it a different way. And I was just here this afternoon watching my best friend in the world, Rhea Elias, talk about her memoir, that she started writing that when she was in her 50s, and she'd never written before. And there's something really audacious and wonderful about that as well. It's a fantastic book, and it couldn't have come any sooner, because she had to live up until that point before she could do it. And the lovely thing and the generous thing about being a writer is it's not like, I don't know, being a swimsuit model or a ballerina where, like, if you haven't made it by the time you're 25, it's not, you're only going to get smarter and wiser and better and more disciplined as you get older, you know, so you know, don't be afraid to hop in at any time.
In Eat, Pray, Love, there's a list of instructions for freedom. And one says, the day is ending, it's time for something that was beautiful to turn into something else that is beautiful. Now let go. And I'm afraid that's where we are now. We've got to move on to the next beautiful thing. But thank you for this beautiful time.
Thank you, Jane.